Good morning, Brian.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Doing good?
Good. Um, there's been a lot of noise lately, I would say over the last year or two, about uh, about therapy. And I guess it popped up for me this week because I think like there's an extreme case of bad therapy on trial with this woman, Lindsay Clancy, that killed three of her children after being diagnosed 32 different pharmaceuticals, psychiatric pharmaceuticals in something like an 8-week period as she was trying to deal with postpartum depression, psychosis, etc. And so in some sense, the pharmaceutical industry is on trial. That's not therapy per se, but it kind of sparked the topic. I think Abigail Schreier, who I really liked for her content as a TERF, kind of making the case for how trans rights and women's rights were in conflict and drawing some clear boundaries there. She kind of pivoted and wrote a book called Bad Therapy. It came out sometime in the last year, and now she's writing an advice column on the Free Press, which makes me a little curious. But the premise. So I guess the way I look at it is that there is a lot of bad therapy out there. I think a lot of people are attracted to therapy as a profession because they are experiencing some internal strife themselves. And so there's I think a great deal, just to oversimplify it, a great deal of projection in the therapy business, where people that probably have a lot of their own work to do are prematurely instead trying to help others. And then you have a lot of modalities that sort of promise to be the be all end all. Like, and they become really popular. People experience all kinds of benefits, and then they kind of fall apart, a few years later. I'm thinking of IFS, for example, the internal family system, where you identify all these parts of you, each of which have their own wants and needs and feelings and roles in your psyche, which from an archetypal standpoint is a really useful idea, but it's not the only modality that is going to get you across multiple football fields of internal work, right? It might be relevant here and there, but it's not, in my opinion, a comprehensive system. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about, and one more thing, therapy is new, as we've talked about on this show, right? The idea of the unconscious and the ego and what's really going on, and the shadow, and um, uh, the how much of our mind we don't have access to, and how busy it is. Um, so so I thought we'd talk a little bit about what good therapy means, and
Right.
how people can tell them apart, if you're in therapy, how do you know if it's moving the boat forward in the water? And yeah, let's start there
Yeah.
and see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked about a lot of the tentacles of this conversation, I think, already. Um, when I was trained as a therapist, I had to go through therapy, which I believe is traditional within certain lineages. And I was, every system has, I guess, their definition of what is complete. Within the Reichian system, it's kind of physiological. So it makes it a little less opinion. They're looking for certain reflexes, in other words. So it's not an opinion based Well, I think you're good now, you know. Uh, uh, but at the same time, I was still pretty young, and I didn't come to understand my own head and for another 25 years. And there's still, elements, of course, that I don't understand. But so how clear one can get to keep um one's own stuff clear from the person you're working with, this is another topic for metacognition. It's another one of these things that is a job that I think only metacognition can do.
Do you want
Um,
to explain metacognition for those that didn't listen to our conversation with Glenna Gerard?
yeah, well, metacognition, I think the easiest way for us to think about it, we often refer to consciousness, conscious of consciousness. So that's what I think. Like, what am I doing now as I'm doing it? It's a self reflective sort of thing that just because you're alive and just because you're conscious doesn't mean you have that capacity. Your dog, you know, as wonderful as he is, he's not conscious that he's conscious. He's quite conscious. I mean, you open that dog food bag and he's conscious. There's no question about it, but he doesn't really realize he's conscious. And although there are times when I wonder, I've seen my dog, various dogs, when they're asleep and they're clearly having a dream. You've seen this, they're running and they might be kind of making little growls or little grunt, and on occasion wake up and you realize that his
They have a choice
experience.
to make. Yeah.
Well, he's like, how did I get here now? I was just chasing this thing and there was this thing. Now I'm here. And you can see he's definitely wondering about his consciousness, although I'm not sure he's conscious that that's what he's doing. So, but, it's that sort of sets the stage, once again, even though we have these metaphysical conversations about the reality of the subjective objective distinction. And even though, as we pointed out, it's a gooey one, it still holds up operationally. Pragmatically, it is certainly a strong as if. And so if we look at things in that light, what is therapy? There's something going on the inside, air quotes, and somehow it's showing up in that inside's relation to the outside. And we have the paradigm of all these different insides and all their different relationships with the outside, such that we can do things like typology, like our previous episode, where it seems like when consciousness encounters the outside, uh, then there's only so many ways the ball comes off the bat, is the typology idea, or it comes off in these categories of ways. So when we're talking about therapy, we're talking about, first of all, having a grasp of what's going on in that process in this particular inside-outside relationship, coming to some sort of an idea of what's out of adjustment, if you will, where the pathos, where the suffering is. So this is a pathology, right? Trying to understand the nature of what's not, where the shoe is rubbing, if you will. And then somehow from outside, trying to do things here on the outside. And in this sense, even body work is on the outside, right? It's like you can't open the cranium and you work with the gray matter. And that's what Reichian therapy tries to work with, the energetics, because the energetics is a bridge between the physical and the mental. But people should recognize, what are we up against here is the mind-body problem, because other people are outside in the world where body is, whether they're feeding pharmaceuticals or they're decoding your childhood or, hypnotizing you or something. They all sort of qualify as outside. And so they're not in that category of mind. And somehow they're trying to go across that medium to interact with mind. And the difficulties that we have in crossing that barrier translate as the difficulties of proving or understanding or making a therapy work. There is a black box problem, right? To the outside world, i.e., the therapist and everyone else, that self is a black box. And why the things come out of it and why the things that you do have in it influence one way or the other, we never see a direct mechanism. We see patterns enough that we can say, okay, there are some things that look like strong candidates for dynamics that might start to explain patterns, but again, it's looking from the outside, right? And so, maybe this is that problem of knowing the thing in itself as opposed to knowing it as a phenomenon, right? The
Can you explain
noumena
that a
of,
little bit?
well, this was this thing that set all the German idealists off, was Kant and this distinction between noumena and phenomena. The noumena is supposedly the thing, air quotes, in itself, for whatever that means. And we only see the thing from the outside, AKA as a phenomena. Or in philosophy, we'd say qua phenomena. Right?
So in other words, we can only experience reality through our own filters.
We can only experience it as a phenomena. The only thing that we have
Which
direct
phenomena
noumenal
means
experience.
that we're putting some spin on the ball.
Well, it doesn't have to be seen as a spin, because when you say putting a spin, it implies that you could somehow not put the spin. It's more like we're sitting in the seat, and the seat carries the perspective, and the perspective is the thing that generates the spin. So it's
Yeah.
a very passive kind of spin that
Having
comes
our
from
foot nailed down,
reality.
having our foot nailed down in a particular room in a particular house means we see the world in a particular way.
And we're in a dimension where you can't manifest and not be nailed down somewhere.
Yeah.
Manifesting is the nailing down process, because it's that particularizing event that makes you in many dimensions, right? So yeah, what do we do to work? I mean, this is what shamanism is about. This is what psychotherapy is about. This is what actually philosophy is about also. That's why I find William James so interesting, because he's the premier American psychologist, literally wrote the textbook for Harvard shortly after the turn of the 1900s in psychology. And he was motivated, as you mentioned, to understand his own. If I say depression, it seems people hear it with a 21st century context. And what his problem, as I recall, was suffering from deterministic philosophy. And
Depressing.
well, it's this idea, right, that philosophy and psychology, because the love of wisdom is about the relationship of the inside to the outside, and psychology is about the relationship of the inside to the outside. And so this is a case where they're pretty intertwined. So if I really believe that everything is preset, that I live in a deterministic universe, then and I therefore believe there is no such thing as free will. If you really take that in your gut, then you have to answer the question, why do anything? Right? And if you don't have a good answer to that question, then you're in a position of existential peril, let's say. And that's what William James charted his way out of through an understanding or developing thereby, and with a lot of research and this guy was very conversant, and very exposed to the thought of the day. And within the idea, the idea of the field of this burgeoning idea called psychology that was just, getting born, kind of, at least by those definitions. Obviously, people have been wondering about their own behavior from in front. But so, uh, yeah, this question was, is there free will or is there not free will? And this is tangled up with the origins of pragmatism, where we don't get tangled up with the idea of an ultimate truth. We start saying, what does this truth do in the real world? A thought is not just a concept. A thought is relevant in how it interacts with that inside-outside relationship somehow. Does it increase our wisdom? Does it increase the positive aspects of our being an incarnated self within a reality, or does it not? And true becomes thusly pragmatically defined. And so very interesting character. And William James' work on pragmatism is going to be the next thing on our audio bookshelf.
Well, the other
We'll
thing
drop
this
that
touches
really soon.
is the question we hit with I think it was Larry Shapiro about what's happiness, because theoretically the outcome of therapy ought to be greater happiness, but that's another inside outside um, uh, challenge.
It seems to me that that's starting at the end point, and that the place we really need to start is with what it is to be human, and that there's a psychological, philosophical, spiritual way to ask that question.
But is it realistic for the millions of people that are going to therapy because they're unhappy for some reason to be challenged with a question like, what does it mean to be human? I mean, you could argue that they're asking themselves that already, but that could
Well,
also
I
be
think
pretty overwhelming. That's deep water.
I'm not sure that the patient client, however you want to put those folks, I'm not sure they're the ones that have to answer that question. I think it's the people that are positing a therapy. You have to, we're going to move you from A to B. Well, you have to define why B is a better place. How are you going to define B as a better place? Well, I say it's because you're getting closer to what it is to be a well-regulated, well-adjusted human being. So your understanding of what exactly that means is pretty tangled up in that.
Let's talk a little bit about what that means. Not to put you on the spot, but that's a great question.
Right. Right. And people have had different ideas about this. Right. There was there's the idea that a child is a blank slate, and that you just kind of scribble whatever you want on there. And I don't think that bears up very well under inspection. Uh, my model is more, comes out of a picture of bonsai or animal husbandry. It's like You know, the most recent example is these little birds sitting over here. My staff of interns, uh, they it's very clear that they have a nature, and it's very clear that if their nature unfolds, dare I say, according to plan, that if they fulfill their nature, they will be healthy and happy. And every farmer, every animal husband knows that there are conditions which support that, and there are conditions which reduce that likelihood. They know that some of the problems will be in the stock and some of the problems will be in the environment you're creating for it. And with skill and time and familiarity with the breed, right? What is that song about wallabies? You better keep your eye on the feed because they're a tricky breed. It's an Australian song, as I recall. uh, Tie your wallaby down. I think that's, uh, but this idea that again, there's an interaction between the inner nature of the thing and the outer world. And there's maybe a preset of what a well-adjusted one of those might be. And it's not, I mean, it's a question we can ponder collectively, but we also ponder it individually,
What do
because asking what it is to be human is only a more generic version of the question. It's a subset of the question, who am I? Right. And I do think everybody has business with that question, that part.
what do
Yeah.
you think about um, the the opposite of a well-regulated human is one who lacks agency or free will or choice to significant extents um, because of the beliefs that they hold, consciously or unconsciously. And so therapy's job is to help a human being become aware of those beliefs so they can be antidoted, resulting in that human being having more choice with the presumption that given that choice, they're going to act out their nature to a greater extent.
Right. Um, I think I recognize that dynamic. I see it in a slightly different way. Rather than seeing uh, people maybe making bad philosophical choices, I think for most of us, we inhabit a cognitive world that has a lot of parts that have been supplied for us. And some have been supplied by large cultural dynamics, but some have also been supplied by more local and more happenstance kind of events
Well,
that
but also by ourselves, right? Like we
as
erect
well.
these survival mechanisms or what Freud called defense mechanisms in reaction to
Right. And so
experiences.
and so the way that shows up to me is that people inhabit worlds that live based on those fundamental assumptions. And so the question really becomes, how do you set people free from worlds that are less than optimal? And so what I'm talking about is more global than a specific belief.
Well, I would
Some
argue that
specific beliefs only make sense in the setting of a world that they
the
are an
world is
expression of.
the world you're describing, I think, is constrained by the network of beliefs that I propose.
Created by, I would suggest.
Created and constrained by. I mean, I guess I think
Yep, yep.
there's a real world too that gets experienced through the filter of this belief system, through the
Yeah,
cognitive
I mean,
model. And so some
the
of it
real
gets
world.
through more or less intact, and some of it gets wildly distorted.
Well, in the real world may be a good percentage movie screen, right? And the degree to which and the control over which we have over the movie becomes the pivot point.
So for example, if we're acting out of beliefs that no longer serve us, we might choose life partners that recreate dynamics that don't further, that reinforce our limiting beliefs.
Right, but it won't look that way. It'll just be picking a partner out of this world that I inhabit.
Right. But also projecting our beliefs about the world onto the movie screen and then recreating the world that we're familiar with.
Right. So
Yeah.
other options just literally don't exist in that particular world. Um, Here's a little plug for a great work of sci-fi. It's actually a series written by local Santa Fe and Roger Zelazny, and they're called the Amber Chronicles, and the first installment is called Nine Princes in Amber. And I don't know that if I've referenced this before, but I found the whole work to be really genius. And it's built around this idea that there is one true world, which is amber, and that there are a million different shadow worlds that are thrown off as shadows of the true world, amber. And that only the princes of amber can walk through those different worlds. Most of the characters that you meet are stuck in their world, right? In other words, most of the characters still have their foots nailed down in the world that they inhabit. And in some of these worlds, different physics applies. And, in some worlds, but anyway, it's the princes in amber who have paid a certain price to be able to walk through shadow. Now, when I was a kid, I did a lot of hitchhiking through the United States and into Canada. And for folks we do have some listeners that aren't in the U.S., and for them, the idea of the U.S. might be rather monolithic. But the reality inside the U.S., like people have made the arguments that it's really 7 different countries, or it's really 11 different countries, or it's because the food, the language, the traditions, all these things change based on geography. And I would hitchhike across and through these places.
The world is different because the set of beliefs that govern is different between those. Fundamentally,
Between
that's what
those,
they're talking about. So the food
exactly,
ends up being different and the customs are different, but it's really the
exactly.
cognitive model. Yeah.
And I would hitchhike through these different worlds. And none of the people that I met were going to go hitchhiking around like I did through. I mean, I'd meet other people, but like most of the people you will meet in your peregrinations in such a fashion are going to be stuck in the place where they live, like most people are. But I traveled around like what felt like to be like a prince in amber. And when I was down south, I learned how to say yes, sir. And, like I learned the different ways of the different places and tried to just be able to walk through there and have everything work for me. Right. And, so I think there's psychological parallels, and that one of the things about a really good therapist is that they can walk through shadow. And this is obviously the best way to do this. You probably know where I'm going, is the old way to do it, which is shamanically, which is you psychoactively join that person for a little while and in some capacity, and are able to be co-present to that world and maybe generate some apertures to a wider world outside of it. Might be a way to think about it. But I think that's what therapists do if they're really effective, and there are this phenomenon of some therapists that just are hitting it out of the park, and most are not doing that. right? Because you can't really do it like a cookbook kind of thing. You know, within shamanism, there are people that want to play songs on recorders, you know, and that's like playing a movie of an operation. It's not going to remove the appendix or whatever you're doing for the patient in the room. Just pointing to the film. See that part where they do that? Yeah, check that out. That's not how that works, right? So, uh, so there's some, I mean, how does one do that? You could say that these problems about inside outside rely on the resource of others who have managed to gain some uh, circumspection about the dynamics that are involved, you know. And I think that that's a hard thing to just teach to a classroom of anybody who thinks they want to learn it and that everybody's going to make it out at the other end. And, you know, I'm not sure it can be taught like that. I think it's a lot more like wheel making and where a calling is kind of necessary, which is a traditional shamanic thing too. And I mean, and I think that people in the helping professions in general, many of them have some calling. Some of them are maybe more cynical, but
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's easy to confuse that calling for the calling to escape one's own um, limiting belief system or wor- limiting world. I guess that's a word we might be coining, where they want to be saved, but they're not conscious of that, or they want to heal themselves, but they're not. They can't grasp what that might look like, and so they go out and try to save the world or save people or help
right.
people,
Well, this is
which is
involved with that
which is
gooiness.
which is altruistic. You know, it's not a bad instinct, but they're not ready.
Well, or that altruism becomes a reflective tool for, you know, realization, hopefully. I think we
I
all
I do think
tilt at a few
therapists.
windmills as
Yeah,
part
and
of the
I know a lot of coaches and therapists who experience provide and shamans um, providing therapy being a growth um, path for themselves. Maybe in some way, like these conversations continue to both merge and expand horizons.
right. Pull new pieces in and mix some together. Yeah, yeah. And well, and see, that's also where this is up against that barrier of certainty. Certainty is relatively attainable within natural sciences, but within the humanities, there's not really much such a thing as certainty. In fact, that's not even the goalpost that's appropriate for that domain, right? And so, which is a hard thing for certain mindsets to grasp.
I, I
Uh,
think I think for all somebody posted something on X recently that I really liked. Um, it was a question along the lines of, you know, is it possible to have an a code of honor that one is fully committed to, and essentially, can one still be willing to update their cognitive model? And having a credo is based on a worldview. It's based on some set of assumptions, and it's necessary to be certain enough to be able to make good choices, whether one is trying to be moral or whatever one thinks good is.
right.
So you sort of have to you have to have a model that you're certain about and open to updating at the
Well,
same
see,
time, and that is tricky.
well, that's the process of life. And is that you got to take it out there onto the track and see how it goes. And then you got to tweak it and you got to come up with your 2.0. And then, this is that impulse of the pragmatic American that says that the proof is in the pudding. So, if one is really refining one's cognitive model, then you might predict, for example, that you get surprised less and less. And this might be one of the things you notice about attentive old people, is that it's very hard to surprise them, you know. Maybe with some new technological thing, they might go, woo, but they're never going to say, oh, this human behaved this way. And they're going to go, I'm shocked. That's not going to happen, right? Not if they've been paying attention to the way humans tend to be. And maybe this is where it gets heuristic. And so certainty becomes less certain, and it becomes more like good taste, or not everybody has it, right? And it's developed over a lifetime, and it's refined, and not everybody's is identical. And yet we do have a general idea when we say that someone has good taste. We don't just say that they have opinion. We don't just imply by that they have opinions that we approve of, but it kind of rides in with that, the idea that they've been through some process that helps them arrive at the capacity to manifest good taste, that they actually have become refined or become wiser somehow in this relationship between the inside and the outside, and what's the harmonious adjustment between the two, how one deals with the world. And I mean, if you don't accumulate that over age, then hello, what are you doing? Uh, because I've mentioned this before, that as you get older, it's like that battle royale video game where you start out and there's a big map and you've got a lot of margin, but that as time goes on, there's a circle that shrinks around you and sort of forces all the players into the same area to resolve the situation, right? Well, life is kind of like that. You start out, you got a lot of margin, and that's good because you don't have a lot to go on. You're gonna make some mistakes, but you got to translate those mistakes to, new operational methodologies that prevent the mistakes from being repeated. Or else, what do they say? If you're not smart, you better be brave.
Or fast. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so that because the lessons won't change, but they might hit harder each time they get reiterated. And so yeah, this is the capacity of building wisdom, is to try to understand the patterns within the apparent chaos.
I mean, that kind of loops back to the question earlier. And I do think, one of the interesting things here is the overlap between psychology, philosophy, and spirituality. Um, the the goal of psychology, or of a therapeutic modality, is therefore, based on what you said, at least to some extent, um, gaining wisdom, or opening the aperture to have greater access to wisdom.
Both focused inside and focused outside. Which is what we're told. Those who of our longtime listeners will remember back to me reading the section of one of the wings of the I Ching where Confucius was explaining, supposedly Confucius was explaining how the sages made the I Ching. And they went all the way onto the inside and they saw how everything worked. They went all the way on the outside and they saw how everything worked. And they connected the two together, which is the mind-body problem, right? And they came up with the I Ching as a result of it. That was their solution, not having supercomputers and data centers, right? And and it's interesting they came up with a binary system, you know. But if you start with yin and yang, you're going to have a binary system, you know. But
And if you think, ultimately, that reality is made up of contrasts, then you're going to come up with a binary system.
and if it's made up of mind, you're going to communicate that binary system through a number of images that become vessels for meaning, which is a very ideographic kind of a way to move at things, right? Um, as opposed to the phonographic, right? The ideographic, writing the idea rather than writing the sound of the word that represents the idea, which is your Sumerian and even Egyptian. Even though you look at Egyptian and it looks like, turns out nobody's really saying foot, fish, those all have other translations that become phonetic because there's only so many things you could say, bird, fish, foot, the squiggly line. It's like nobody really says that. They're saying words that share the sound of the words for those things. Right. So it is phonetic, even though it looks like you're drawing a picture.
Huh.
Yeah. But Rosetta Stone aside, the idea now, given the setting that we've created, we can get to the question where you say that here's a guy who's taken 19 different psychoactive drugs to try to fix his problem. This is, obviously something on the outside, some matter that is going to be injected into the meatware that's supposed to affect via the boundary of the black box, the actual experience of the self inside that inner place. So that obviously has to come out of the model that says that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of
It has to
matter.
be deterministic, exactly, and
And it has to be
materialistic.
materialist and reductionist at the
Yeah,
same time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, that's the problem with pharmaceuticals, and especially where it comes to the mind. I mean, I
Well,
think
that
there's a
is a
similar
world.
problem with pharmaceuticals as a therapy for purely physical problems too. I think you end up running into the same issue where if you are thinking deterministically and mechanically and materialistically about the body, you still miss the interconnectedness of all things issue, and um, end up missing a lot of therapeutic opportunity and potentially doing harm in the process.
Well, and this is also sort of creates the landscape that is the background wherein these disciplines like internal arts, like certain yogas, to actually manipulate the energetic bridge, which is the thing, the way the Chinese describe it, Shen or consciousness is the general sitting up on the hill, watching the battle on the field below. And the soldiers that are actually there clashing, that's the actual meat that's doing the work, that's interacting with the 3D world out there. But somehow they know there's some mystery. How does the general tell the soldiers what to do? Move left, move right, move forward, move backwards. He does it the Western cavalry way was with the bugle. Dun, 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 and everybody
And
hears that and goes,
flags
that's
too.
the way the Chinese did it was with big banners. And so when you see the flag that says head for home, you know that everybody knows at the same time we're doing this, because this is the problem that still exists today, is known as command and control, right? Well, so there is a command and control relationship between consciousness and the meatware. Look, right? They couldn't do that without the general sending the message. So for the Chinese, the banner that drives the troops is qi, and everybody wants to have these cosmic intellectual conversations about whether such a thing as qi exists or not, which is not the point. the point, I maintain that it should be taken provisionally as an explanation for why you should do certain practices, and that the results that come from those practices, if you do them long enough and you do them right, will be self-explanatory, and you'll know what people mean by chi. Just because you haven't done those and you haven't had those experiences does not give you the foundation to judge that there is no such thing. That's like somebody coming up with a word in a foreign language that you don't happen to know. And so, since you don't happen to know that word, you don't think that the thing that they're calling that with that word exists. Well, that's just silliness, right? But this it
And
turns out
what
people
we're
waste time
talking
on this
about is the
argument.
is the um, membrane. The let, let, membrane might not be the best analogy, but uh, let's go with the membrane between internal and external. The medium through which information passes and gets filtered, and it has its own quality. And if you don't believe that the subjective exists, therefore the internal exists, and so your cognitive model is entirely assuming that everything is deterministic and has physical cause and effects, you're not aware of that membrane. You think that the internal is also just a happenstance of these physical causes and effects.
Yeah, you go into this world of a lot of really miraculous coincidences. And we've mentioned this before. How do you want to take your miracles? Do you want to take it as one big miracle, or do you want to divide it up into four little miracles? You still don't solve the miracle problem.
I think we're pointing at the question Michael Wolff asked about if synchronicity exists, how could the universe be anything other than a dream? Meaning fundamentally idealistic, not materialistic.
Meaning
But
fundamentally consciousness.
yeah, yeah. But I don't see why it's not fundamentally both. And in the world of this membrane is where synchronicity gets translated. Like if both the material and the idealistic exist, and there's transmutation of each across this boundary into the other, I don't think I have a problem with that. I wonder what he would say.
Well, my understanding of these things is that at a beginner level, they're excuses for you to do a practice. After you have performed the practice to fruition, you can go back to those things and you go, oh, that's why they said it that way. But without the referent, you're holding it as a dicho, right? It's just like a proverb until you get to a certain place and you look back and say, oh, that's why they say it's like this. But it didn't, I was thinking how they meant that differently when I didn't have a firsthand experience. And so it might have sounded crazy or fanciful but after you go, it's hindsight being 2020. Once you've had the experience, then you go, oh, that's what they're referring to. That's why that makes sense according to this map, right? When this means that and that means this on this map, then that makes sense. Yeah. And
So
they
is
play
it
with that. The Zen guys play with that, right? That's the part of the whole trick of Zen is to play with that. Yeah, go ahead.
um so so fair to say that it might be worth considering therapy if you have some inkling that your world needs an update. Um, and to put a finer point on that, the beliefs that you're holding that make up your world, um, could be one or two clicks closer to reality. And that would result in you having more choice, more agency, being more yourself, understanding more what it means to be human. And that you'll know if your therapy is good, if you um, experience your world changing and presumably for the better. Can we say anything about for the better other than it giving us more choice?
Well, sometimes to get to that for the better, you might have to go through a temporarily not all that great. Because sometimes we can paint ourselves in a corner where we need to take some kind of an action to escape the corner, and that we can paint ourselves into drastic positions. You remember I made reference to people having a fundamentally dishonest relationship with reality, and that somehow they translated that as a necessity for the personality to successfully navigate the inside and the outside. And you said, well, don't we always kind of know when we're bullshitting ourselves? And my response was,
I'm surprised I said that
oh,
because I've made a career out of bullshitting myself and not knowing it
oh,
until much later.
oh, well, or maybe I was saying, don't we always know? And you were saying sometimes we don't see it. But the that's probably what it was. But the episode that just I've been passively observing the race, and I couldn't miss the thing about the Cambridge professor,
Yeah.
and uh, that seemed to me to be the example of a person who was taking the strategy of sort of uh, blending the fantasy reality thing and, kind of engaging people in that, which is, I don't think it's as simple as he was telling lies and they all believed it. I think it's a lot closer to this idea that he was inhabiting a world that had a particular relationship, suspicious though it was, with reality, and other people were joining him in that world. And now we're saying, well, you should have been wiser than that. But I think it's almost parallel to when people fall in with gurus or Jim Jones. And now we look and we go, ah, well, there is a kind of a mental contagion and that's why I explain it as it isn't just a belief. It's big. It's more pervasive than a belief. It's a world. And within that world, there are certain things that translate, and you see people's reactions change a lot. Like if you watch somebody when they join a religious cult and they shut off their family, right? You see all of a sudden, it's not uncommon that their relationship with the world at large changes radically. And now what was acceptable in the world at large, now it's evil, or now what's got it. And they didn't exactly create that.
How do you know
If you've
you're in
had
good
good
therapy?
therapy.
You were talking about kind of like the extreme opposite of finding yourself in Jim Jones' cult um, and not realizing that you've updated your belief system in an incredibly destructive way.
Right. And that this belief system translates to seeing the world. I don't think it's an over exaggeration to say you start to inhabit a different world. And when one becomes aware of this, which I did when I was younger, I didn't actually join any cults, but I was like close enough to observe and to sort of get an idea of how things translated. And then I understood a little bit how the whole Manson thing could have happened. Or, I did know some people in some different religious cults, and all of a sudden they were in a different world. and it wasn't an entirely healthy one. Right. But so now, if we think about a person in a therapeutic situation, they've kind of gotten off into a side world that maybe is not entirely healthy. And so the question is, how do we join that world in a way that we can understand it and create an aperture back to normalized. Now that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're marching with Das Man, right? Like you're going to cut your legs off with Procrustes but it does mean that there is a certain amount of sort of self-determination, and people can move from worlds to worlds. And I would argue that this is one of your better arguments for free will. But we'll save that maybe for another episode. But
Yeah, I
um,
like that thread. But to maybe just to stay on the salud.
I'm not going to mute because God knows well
Yeah.
my
Um,
device.
so that thought started with if you start therapy, even good therapy, your suffering might increase, and I guess I would attribute that to it's terrifying to let go of beliefs that you've presumably adopted because they seemed necessary for survival, or if not survival, then sense making, which I think is a form of survival.
Yeah,
If you're real
absolutely.
young and you can't make sense, that's a really scary situation. So you create concepts in it turns out, I think, in a somewhat predictable way that allow you to make sense of unreasonable situations.
And there are autonomy questions. Uh, yeah, what is the situation? I can only imagine that someone ends up on 19 different pharmaceuticals, or changes, or however that worked. Uh, it isn't just a question of a materialist worldview that says that this problem is purely chemical, and so I'll just start, you know, when you can't, when you're trying to fix your truck and you can't find exactly what's wrong with it. You know what you fire up? You fire up what we call the parts cannon, and you just start shooting parts at everything that possibly could be involved. You just fire up the parts cannon, right? This sounds suspiciously like that.
Yeah.
And and these parts are not without an effect, right? Because everything you do into that system, and that's why I say, unless you're in the most dire of circumstances, avoid pharmaceuticals. And I mean that, recreationally as well,
I think that's where the
because
automotive analogy breaks down, though, because presumably, if you're putting in new parts, the worst you're doing is wasting money. You're probably not making the situation worse if you're using, good parts.
this is more like breaking the nuts and the bolts as you're going in to
Yeah.
change the parts. Maybe you don't know. That's the thing. I'm not going to say that there aren't some situations, you know, uh, uh, I do believe that there are circumstances where perhaps you move somebody from a desperate situation a little farther off the ledge so that you can start employing less drastic measures that
Sure.
might be less impactful.
Yeah, yeah,
But
no, I'm aware personally of situations where, antipsychotic medications have made a tremendous difference.
oh yeah, and there are times where even, I think maybe intense things like benzos might be appropriate, but they shouldn't be the go-to. And patience, the important thing is you have some autonomy in the process, and realize that the authority comes from its own world, and that's a world that's constantly getting updated as well. At least we hope so, because we used to, and I think we still do in certain cases, use leeches, but I digress. uh, I think there's places for cupping where that actually makes sense too. So I won't.
And maybe lobotomies.
Well, I don't know about that. Maybe in certain political situations, but I digress. Uh, I just caution people always that there are things that you can do to your brain that are very difficult, if not impossible, to undo. So that's got to be kind of kept in mind. And uh, insofar as that's a reality, and that's where, exploring things has a different cost. It means that sometimes we have to do things that are maybe emotionally uncomfortable for us, or we have to face things we didn't want to face. We have to kind of, you know, look at it, not look away. And so we kind of don't want to take any wooden nickels because we think it's an easier way to solve a difficult problem. You know, and the if a problem is on the inside, I think the best and most direct place to work with it is on the inside. And within the Chinese tradition, they have the neidan and the waidan, the internal pill and the external pill. The external pill was things like, there was an emperor that died taking mercury because they thought that anything this cool has got to be good for you, right? I mean, and mercury is pretty cool, right? Or cinnabar, as they referred to it as. But it turns out it's kind of toxic. And but there were nidon, the all uses of herbs and things, which are totally valid and very valuable. Those are all kind of waidan, outside pill. Nadon are all the internal practices. And there are mental circumstances that we get ourselves out of through taking certain mental steps. Some of these things toughen us. Some of these things develop mental calluses, or the ability to do more push-ups or to, gain more candle power on our internal flashlight, if
I
you
do
will.
think a lot of that does boil down to having more choice in more and more stressful situations. And I don't mean to use like that kind of one heuristic as the be all end all. It's not. I do think there are other ways to other like pointing to greater wisdom, pointing to greater happiness, whatever that means. Those are also very valuable outcomes of philosophy, therapy, spiritual pursuit, etc. But having more choice is worth a lot, and a lot of the experiences that we have where we're suffering um, are um, are situations in which we don't have access to a choice that would allow us to suffer less or to relate to our suffering differently, which allows us to suffer less.
Right. Well, and remember, choice is a manifestation of freedom and a cognitive freedom that's been won a certain way. And that cognitive freedom is sits right next to autonomy, and having your own power, which gives you the power of choice.
Yeah.
And so, and this points to some of the potential downfalls of a relationship with a therapist. If you go to a therapist and they're the authority, and it's like, here, and I dump it all on you. Now it's your problem. That's not going to put us in a position of autonomy.
Yeah.
Now, and remembering that therapists have bills to pay, and therapists, they got to keep their rent paid. And at the same time, they're also engaged in a world where they are the helpers. And just like not every parent raises their children to autonomy, not every therapist brings their clients to freedom. Uh, and I think that if a person really communicates, that they really feel better and they're really making progress and they make the therapist feel good, It's very difficult for the therapist to say, okay, I think we're done here. And, my teacher, when he was with our grandmaster, he was like a protege for years until finally Master Cho said to him, you have to go start your own school now. You have to go be your own person, And uh, now this was a guy that had already been to tours of duty, in the jungle in Vietnam. But it was still easier to hang out with Cho. And Cho's an amazing guy, and every minute spent with him is valuable. So I totally get it. And yet, at the same time, there's a point where you have to take what you learn and you got to take it out into the field. You have to go spread your wings, grasshopper. And so that's what therapy really wants to be building. It doesn't want you to build a dependency on a person, and it shouldn't be encouraging a dependency on an external pill, a Wydon. Uh, there's arguments within Chinese medicine whether there are such things as tonic herbs. That is, herbs that you take when you're not sick to get you to health, but things that you just take in general. And, there's people argue both sides. And everybody's got something wrong enough if you wait long enough that there's always some herb that's going to help them if you get the right one and you understand the setting it's going into. But same sort of an idea. But so, yeah, I'm not going to say that they can't be useful, but I'm not sure it's a skill that you learn in a school. It might be that you learn in the school the thing that gives you the license to go out to try to learn for real in the real world. And maybe school tells you some of the worst mistakes to avoid and some things that may help once in a while or seem to. And then you
Well,
go out and you find
I
out
think,
whether you have the Kavorka or not,
I mean, I think you learn a lot of frameworks, um,
Yeah.
or modalities,
Yeah.
and that's really useful because
And techniques.
modalities illuminate one another, right? So if we're talking about opening apertures in a world, in order to create access to a bigger one that's closer to reality, then one framework might get you a first down or two, but then you need another framework, to for your
Well, see,
shotgun
that's the danger.
formation.
The danger is that it gets seen as just upgrading frameworks, but that's all propositional. And the actual capacity to do the job is dispositional.
Right. Again, that's
And
a mind body question.
it's a mind body question and a time question.
Yep.
Right. So, and that's why where I refer to accumulating time body
Yeah.
is building that across generations. And that's also why I'm such a fan of apprenticeships, because an apprenticeship, yeah, they'll give you a lot of propositional stuff, but you'll get to feel the disposition. You'll get to witness the disposition working, and you'll be able to get the vibe of it, to use a hippie word. But there is something to it. There is what we call an energetic transmission
Yeah.
in certain disciplines that does give you some advantage dispositional shift wise.
Yeah.
Right. And it's been exposure to those things, which is why this is one of my biggest one string banjo hits. Look at the disposition. When I point from proposition to disposition, what is the difference that's really going on there? Proposition is being conscious of an outer thing, right? This law, this truth, this phenomena, whatever the proposition is. Disposition is consciousness, once again, conscious of consciousness. I'm aware that I need a mode of operation to do a certain job in its optimal way. In martial arts, when I get attacked, if you're in a tradition that actually does real movement, there's a disposition that I go into that comes from those years of association. Same thing with bouncing. You get the feeling something's happening, there's a disposition. If you are a desert person and you spend time walking around the desert, you are going to, at one point or another, meet a rattlesnake, especially if you live out here. And you will find that your brain has a default disposition that I was up in the hills once and I heard a sound that I thought was the wind in the dried oak leaves. And then the wind stopped, but the sound kept going. And I had this brief moment of cognitive dissonance, feeling that something wasn't. And in that instant of cognitive dissonance, I was leaping. I cleared about 10 feet away from where I ultimately came back to find the sound came from. And I went back, and there in the oak leaves was the rattlesnake. But this is like we've been doing this a long time.
But then
So we have
there's
a
yet
disposition
another
autopilot
disposition.
around it.
There's yet another disposition that after you've encountered a bunch of rattlesnakes, you you have when you hear that sound, before you leap, there's now a series of choices that you can make.
Well, and it
Um,
was as I was leaping that I realized that must mean that there's a rattlesnake there.
yeah.
But that was, right, that right brain that's looking in the environment for it doesn't know what. The left brain is the one that's
Open.
looking for the berries or comes back later and says that was a rattlesnake.
Mhm.
But it was like a global reading. Something is off in the environment and I can't pinpoint it. But while I'm busy not pinpointing it, that global brain is boing, and I'm like a kangaroo, right? So, but that's interesting because it's a hemisphere thing, and it's a totally autopilot thing. You didn't train that at all, and good luck trying to train that. But it's a dispositional shift, totally different awareness, different operating system. Like you I can't imagine a way that you could get a brain scan on somebody when they're going through that, but I bet it would be interesting to see
Yeah.
how the message
Well,
traveled.
I think that work has been done.
Has it?
Yeah.
If they don't know the rattlesnake's coming, yeah, that'd be
Yeah.
interesting.
Um, yeah, I guess I was just wanting to make sure our listeners are also grokking that dispositional shift that or disposition that results from an energetic transmission in like a master apprentice kind of relationship over a period of years is also about manifesting like a a modality that's like both a physical knowledge and an embodied knowledge, let's say,
Well,
or
that's
an
what I was going
embodied
to say.
wisdom.
You learn that from your teacher's body,
Yeah.
not from their words, not from
Also from their words, or
I mean,
not
their
just
words
their
can
words,
point
but their
at it.
yeah, um, their their mindset for sure is part of the transmission. Their 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 words absolutely can be too.
They can
Like
help, but
like
the
people
reason
have
I'm so
mannerisms, and words are part of those mannerisms, and that's in the sum of the parts that's
right.
getting transmitted. Yeah.
But the reason that I respond to the words and how limited the transmission is through the words is because now, for example, in Tai Chi Chuan, there's a lot of people that have onboarded all these words, but they got their Tai Chi from somebody who also had only onboarded words. Like there was no source of the actual what it is, so that they try to explain themselves. Oh, well, this is this, but it's not coming from like, oh, here I'm blocking a kick from a person that's never, ever blocked a real kick that was really trying to kick them to understand the problem, really. But they go off in their head with words about it. It's like, oh, it's yielding. And turns out there's a trick to it, right? And if you don't know the trick, then the propositional knowledge is almost a way to misdirect you.
Hmm.
So, like in some of the transmission books, there's intentional mistakes put in with the idea that only someone who was uh, initiated into the lineage, they would read that and they would laugh. And so they're not going to be fooled. But somebody who just swiped the book, for example, those are like locks. That's a keyed text that if you don't have the keys, you won't get all the goodies out, right? And that's a thing. That's been a traditional thing,
Hmm.
So, but anyway,
Cool.
so yeah, I think there's a lot there, and what we're really talking about is that inside-outside relationship yet again, and can it be troubleshot, and we really have to learn our
How do we
ways
help each
around
other
that.
with it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I hope that we kind of expanded the field that you can see these things in. That it's not, there's this impetus to what's the word? It's like commodify, but
Totalize.
well, it's a version of that, but it's a specific phenomenon where you make something into a sickness or a disease
Oh,
so
yeah.
that you can sell a solution to it. And a lot of these things, whether it's really a disease or not, is purely taxonomic. But if we recognize it as a disease, I can sell you something for it. But if it's considered like a
Pathologize.
challenge of life that everybody grows through and balances, there's no profit stream in that, right?
It's pathologize.
They've pathologized certain things that are just like growing up. And when I say growing up, I don't just mean out of adolescence. I mean growing up all the way through,
Hmm.
right? So that's something to point to also is, I'm a great believer for you feeling a freedom to say bullshit when an expert makes a pronouncement that they stand to profit from. You at least have to try on bullshit seriously before you bite.
Yeah.
Um,
Incentives are
because
real.
Well, that's like what's the old saying? It's like asking a barber if you need a haircut.
Or a lawyer. Does this contract look good?
Exactly. Do I really need you on retainer?
All right. Um,
Good.
cool. To be continued.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Brian.
See you next time.